Tonight, we set out on a journey unlike any other, exploring the tragic graves of celebrities who committed suicide to find the resting places of names the world never let go of. We will pass a pink marble crypt stained by decades of lipstick from strangers who paid millions to be buried beside it. We will stand over a stolen memorial stone that had to be quietly replaced in the dirt. Every resting place we visit hides a different kind of mystery. The pale pink marble face of Crypt Number 24 at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles is stained permanently red, dyed by decades of lipstick kisses from strangers who still refuse to let the most famous woman in the world rest in peace. She was the ultimate Hollywood icon, a silver screen blonde whose private pain was constantly eclipsed by a manufactured public glow. When Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, the official coroner's ruling was a probable suicide by overdose, a quiet and abrupt end to a life lived entirely in the glare of flashbulbs. Her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, took control of the aftermath, orchestrating a strictly private funeral and sealing her in a modest wall crypt in the Corridor of Memories. For the next 20 years, he ensured a half-dozen fresh red roses were delivered to the bronze vase on her marker 3 times a week. Those roses became a physical anchor in the cemetery, a quiet marker of genuine grief that the public desperately wanted to consume. The funeral ended, but the spectacle surrounding her remains did not. While official cemetery records show her body has laid undisturbed inside that sealed drawer, a relentless secondary industry grew around her resting place. Fans and opportunists have spent decades fighting just for physical proximity to her bones. The crypt directly above hers was occupied by a local businessman whose widow later claimed he demanded to be buried face down so he could spend eternity looking at her. When his crypt was briefly put up for public auction decades later to pay off mortgage debts, bidding quickly reached into the millions before the sale ultimately fell apart. Just one space to her left lies another fiercely contested plot, quietly purchased in 1992 by Hugh Hefner, the magazine publisher who launched his massive media empire using her unconsenting nude image. He paid thousands to ensure he would spend death right beside the woman he commodified in life. It is a surprisingly small cemetery, hidden away behind towering concrete office buildings, yet her simple rectangular marker remains a site of fierce, ongoing obsession. The tarnished bronze plaque bears only her name and the years of her life, offering no other answers to the crowds who still press their painted lips against the cold stone. The official records say she is finally alone. The heavily stained marble says otherwise. Leaving Marilyn behind to look for a quieter resting place, we arrive at a burial plot defined not by one body, but by 2. The painter who captured sunflowers and starry nights in frantic strokes died largely ignored by the world. In July 1890, he suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the abdomen. The official ruling was suicide. He was buried in the municipal Cimetière d'Auvers-sur-Oise, a small farming village north of Paris. Because of the nature of his death, the local Catholic priest refused to allow the funeral carriage inside the church, banishing the grave to the very edge of the cemetery, right against the outer wall. Today, visitors leave yellow flowers, loose coins, and wooden paintbrushes on a plain, rounded stone marker. The official account says he walked into a nearby wheat field and ended his own life. What has never been proven, though art historians still fiercely argue over it today, is the persistent modern theory that he was actually struck by a stray bullet from a reckless local teenager, choosing to cover for the boy with his dying breath rather than see him punished. The funeral ended. The story did not. The most striking object here is not Vincent's headstone, but the identical one right next to it, completely bound to his by a thick, sprawling blanket of English ivy. When Vincent died, his devoted younger brother Theo collapsed from grief and illness, passing away a mere 6 months later. Theo was originally buried far away in the Netherlands. For 24 long years, the brothers were separated by international borders. Then, in 1914, Theo's widow decided the arrangement was fundamentally wrong. She had Theo's remains exhumed from his resting place in Utrecht and transported by train back to France, carrying him to the stone wall at Auvers-sur-Oise to be reinterred inches from Vincent. A local doctor, who had treated the painter in his final days, planted a single sprig of ivy from his own garden to gracefully cover the freshly disturbed earth. Cemetery caretakers note that over the last century, the winding roots of that ivy have grown so deep and thick beneath the soil that they have entirely encased both coffins. The surface shows two distinct stone markers bearing two distinct names. Beneath the earth, the roots have permanently fused the brothers into a single, immovable mass. While Van Gogh's quiet resting place in France settled into a peaceful silence over a century, the grave of grunge pioneer Chris Cornell remains the center of a loud and bitter dispute. He was the defining voice of a heavy musical era, the frontman of Soundgarden whose towering, gravelly vocal range felt entirely untouchable. In 2017, that legendary voice stopped abruptly in a Detroit hotel room. The medical examiner officially ruled his death a suicide, stating the grim facts plainly in the public record and immediately closing the criminal investigation. His remains were cremated, flown to California, and buried in Los Angeles at the historic Hollywood Forever Cemetery. The plot sits beneath a flat, heavy bronze grave marker under the deep shade of mature trees, situated intentionally just mere feet from the memorial of his close friend Johnny Ramone. Visitors leave a constant, daily rotation of plastic guitar picks, handwritten letters, and small river stones directly on the bronze plaque, treating the manicured cemetery space less like a traditional resting place and far more like an active, breathing shrine. The funeral ended. The story did not. The official account firmly points to a tragic, self-inflicted end, yet his family and thousands of dedicated fans immediately pushed back against the ruling. Medical records show he had several prescription drugs in his system on the night he died, most notably a severe dose of potent anxiety medication. The family argued fiercely that this sudden chemical imbalance severely altered his mind and stripped away his intent, making it a medical tragedy rather than a conscious, deliberate choice. Meanwhile, darker corners of the internet spun entirely unproven theories of foul play and elaborate cover-ups that continue to circulate widely online. What has never been proven is whether the substances swirling in his blood were the true architects of his final moments. The central anchor of this unending dispute is not the physical grave marker itself, but an invisible toxicology report that turned a seemingly closed police case into a permanent question mark. The official coroner's ruling remains entirely unchanged. The ashes rest quietly beneath the Hollywood earth, constantly surrounded by the physical tributes of those who utterly refuse to accept the narrative typed on his death certificate. Every afternoon, the cemetery groundskeepers carefully clear away the weathered guitar picks scattered across the bronze, but by the next morning, new ones always appear. The grave is perfectly maintained. The answer is not. Leaving the Seattle rain that washes over Chris Cornell, we cross the Atlantic to a memorial stone that someone wanted badly enough to pry from the earth under the cover of darkness. Ian Curtis was the brooding voice and lyricist of Joy Division, a pioneer of post-punk, whose deep baritone delivered anthems of profound isolation while he battled rapidly worsening epilepsy behind closed doors. The official ruling was suicide in May of 1980, abruptly ending his life just days before the band was scheduled to depart on a highly anticipated American tour. His body was cremated, and the ashes were buried in Macclesfield Cemetery in Cheshire, England. The burial site was marked by a simple, square memorial stone resting flat against the grass. His widow chose the permanent inscription, deeply etching the title of his most enduring song, "Love Will Tear Us Apart," into the pale gray stone. For nearly 3 decades, this modest plot became a quiet site of international pilgrimage. Fans traveled to the industrial northwest of England to leave guitar picks, faded concert photographs, handwritten letters, and half-smoked cigarettes scattered across the marker. The funeral ended in 1980, but the physical history of the grave did not. Cemetery records show that on a Tuesday morning in July 2008, groundskeepers arrived to find a ragged, rectangular hole in the turf. The inscribed stone was entirely gone. Someone had entered the cemetery during the night and stolen the heavy marker right off the top of his buried ashes. Fans immediately speculated about obsessed collectors, black market music memorabilia, and dark fandom rituals, while local police searched the surrounding grounds for clues. The original stone has never been recovered. A replacement was quickly laid down to cover the bare earth, identical in wording but slightly different in its typeface, resetting the physical boundary of the grave. The disruption did not stop there. In 2019, another piece of the grave setup, a smaller central mowing stone used to hold floral tributes, also vanished into the night. While authorities treat these as straightforward, morbid thefts, a lingering unease surrounds the plot. Visitors still walk through the rows of Macclesfield Cemetery to stand over the new stone, leaving their picks and pennies, but they are paying their respects to a patched grave. The site remains a quiet fixture on cemetery maps. The original piece of it is simply gone, sitting silently in an unknown room. Leaving the quiet desperation of Macclesfield behind, we find a different kind of silence in the heart of Stockholm, where a grave is visited by fans from across the globe. Yet for months after the funeral, no one outside an intimate circle knew exactly where the body had been buried. Known to the world as the electronic dance music pioneer Avicii, he spent his 20s commanding crowds of tens of thousands under blinding stadium lights, a public spectacle that stood in stark contrast to his final days. In 2018, the official ruling stated he took his own life while on a retreat in Oman, abruptly ending a relentless, highly documented touring schedule that had severely broken his physical and mental health. His body was flown back to Sweden and quietly interred at the Hedvig Eleonora Church Cemetery, a historic, tree-lined burial ground in the affluent Östermalm district. His family purchased a private plot, marked by a heavy, unadorned stone slab that sits perfectly flush with the manicured earth. Visitors looking for a towering monument to a modern global superstar will not find one. Instead, the dark stone serves as a quiet anchor, frequently covered in brightly colored, handmade festival bracelets, left by international travelers who cross oceans just to stand in the freezing Swedish air. The official account confirms the burial was a deeply private affair, restricted strictly to those who knew the boy named Tim before the fame took hold. But the absolute secrecy surrounding his final resting place birthed a frantic digital hunt. In the immediate, chaotic weeks following his burial, desperate fans aggressively scoured public death registries and mapped out local churchyards, convinced that his management had secretly moved his remains to prevent the creation of a chaotic, permanent public shrine. Cemetery records show the family simply wanted peace, deliberately delaying the carving of his actual name into the stone to give themselves time to mourn without an audience. The private funeral service finally ended. The intense public obsession did not. Even today, local groundskeepers are forced to quietly clear away the neon plastic beads and handwritten letters to preserve the traditional solemnity of the 17th-century Swedish churchyard, only for new offerings to mysteriously appear by the very next morning. The stadium music stopped years ago. The silent struggle over who truly gets to claim his memory in the dirt remains unresolved. From the electronic rhythms of a modern life cut short, to the silence of the Ketchum Cemetery in Idaho, the finality of Ernest Hemingway's resting place is as stark as the prose he left behind. In July of 1961, the man who defined the 20th-century American literary voice died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, ending a long struggle with physical and mental decline. He lies beneath a simple, bronze-plated marker that bears only his name, the dates of his life, and the location, shielded from the tourists who once crowded his homes in Cuba and Key West. While the official account of his death is a matter of public record, the grave itself became a site of peculiar pilgrimage, where the earth has been worn away by the feet of those seeking a connection to a man who spent his life crafting myths about endurance. Visitors frequently leave behind bottles of whiskey, pens, or spent cartridges, transforming a quiet patch of mountain soil into a repository for the restless spirits of his readers. There is no elaborate mausoleum here, no grand statue to commemorate the Nobel Prize winner, only the cold reality of a plot facing the Wood River Valley. Cemetery records confirm his interment, but for decades, rumors persisted that the original burial site was contested by local religious authorities due to the nature of his passing, leading to the quiet, almost industrial simplicity of the current marker. What has never been proven, despite the insistence of literary sleuths, is whether the body buried in the Idaho earth truly reflects the man who survived 2 plane crashes and a war, or if the myth of his rugged independence was simply too large to be contained by a standard burial. The funeral ended in the summer of 1961, but the scrutiny of his final decision persists, fueled by the starkness of his chosen end. A single, weathered pen resting on the bronze plate is often the only thing that remains by morning, a silent tribute to a writer who meticulously documented the deaths of others, only to find himself unable to control the narrative of his own. The grave is still there, tucked into the shadow of the Sawtooth Mountains, but the answer to why he chose this specific valley as his final vantage point remains buried with him. The shotgun that ended the life of Ernest Hemingway in 1961 cast a long, cold shadow over his granddaughter, Margot Hemingway, who died by a drug overdose in 1996, becoming the fifth person in 4 generations of her family to end their own life. She is buried in Ketchum Cemetery in Ketchum, Idaho, resting in the same earth as the grandfather she spent her final years trying to escape. Yet their markers offer a starkly different experience for those who make the pilgrimage to the Sawtooth Mountains. While Ernest's gravesite is a chaotic, well-trodden plot, often littered with empty bottles of alcohol and discarded cigarettes left by admirers, Margot's headstone remains a quieter, more isolated point of reflection. The official ruling on her death was a suicide, a conclusion reached after investigators discovered her body alone in her Santa Monica apartment. But the proximity of her final resting place to her grandfather's has invited a grim folkloric obsession with a perceived familial curse. The grave itself is modest, a simple stone set against the high-altitude landscape of the Wood River Valley, a stark contrast to the sprawling celebrity culture that defined her brief, frantic career as a supermodel. Visitors often stand between the two graves, staring at the names carved into the granite, trying to reconcile the public image of a woman who graced the cover of Vogue with the reality of a family history that seemed to draw her inexorably toward the same Idaho soil. There is no theft here, no desecration, and no missing remains, yet the site persists as a magnet for those seeking a physical manifestation of a psychological shadow. The cemetery records are precise, confirming the dates and the placement, but they provide no comfort to the skeptics who believe her burial in Ketchum was a final surrender to a destiny she was desperate to outrun. The official account of her passing is documented in court files and coroner reports, sealing the narrative of a life cut short by private anguish. But the tourists still arrive in the thin mountain air, clutching their cameras, searching the inscriptions for a pattern that might not be there at all. The funeral ended in the summer of 1996. The conversation about the Hemingway lineage never truly has. The grave is still there. The answer is not. From the troubled life of a fashion icon, we turn to the rigid, deliberate exit of George Eastman, the man who brought photography to the masses but could not capture a future for himself. In 1932, the titan of industry sat at his desk, placed a note beside him stating that his work was done and there was no reason to wait, and died by a single gunshot wound. He was not laid to rest in a public monument or a sprawling garden cemetery, but rather interred quietly in the grounds of his own estate in Rochester, New York, within a wall of the very building he had transformed into the George Eastman Museum. The grave is not a typical plot of earth marked by a standing stone, but a simple, almost industrial plaque set into the stone of the house itself. It is a site that invites a strange kind of intimacy, as visitors walk through the rooms of his legacy and find themselves feet away from his remains, without the traditional separation of hallowed ground. For decades, the official record has remained clear, and the museum staff maintain the site with a precision that mirrors the man's own obsession with order. Yet, the story lingers on the oddity of his final choice to be buried inside the walls of his company's birthplace, rather than a family plot. Some visitors find the arrangement cold, suggesting that a man who spent his life documenting the world should have been released to the earth, while others see it as the ultimate expression of his total commitment to the industry he built. There is no theft here, no desecrated headstone, and no shifting of the bones, yet the feeling persists that he never truly left his office. The plaque is polished, the stone is cold, and the air in the room is maintained at a precise temperature to preserve the artifacts of a life defined by light and shadow. The funeral ended in the quiet solitude of his library. But the debate over whether he surrendered to his own perfectionism or simply succumbed to a private pain remains unresolved. The body is in the wall, the camera is shuttered, and the records remain as closed as the door to his final room. The grave is still there, but the man inside is perpetually at work. While the shadows of industrial giants like George Eastman still loom over their silent, marked plots, the final resting place of James Whale, the man who defined the visual language of horror cinema with his direction of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man, is a quiet, almost anonymous conclusion for a life defined by creative vision and eventual isolation. After he took his own life in 1957, following years of declining health and the burden of living as an openly gay director in a studio system that demanded absolute conformity, his remains were cremated. There is no traditional grave to visit, no granite slab bearing his name to be weathered by the rain, and no specific location where a fan might leave a token of appreciation. His ashes were interred in the Columbarium of Remembrance at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. The official record lists his placement in a niche, a space defined by glass and brass. Yet this finality has not silenced the persistent, lingering curiosity about his departure. Because there was no public funeral, and the details of his passing remain shrouded in the private, often stifling atmosphere of 1950s Hollywood, rumors have circulated for decades about the state of his personal papers and the missing pieces of his later years. The industry that once celebrated his genius had largely moved on, leaving his legacy to be reconstructed from fragmented accounts and a handful of surviving interviews. In the columbarium, his name sits alongside thousands of others, rendered in uniform lettering that strips away the individuality of his cinematic contributions. Visitors who go looking for a monument to the creator of the monster find only a small, sealed compartment in a wall, an object of containment rather than celebration. The industry records are clear on the date and the method, yet the absence of a grave marker that reflects the man behind the camera creates a strange, hollow feeling for those who try to connect with his history. The public image of the director was one of absolute control, but his final resting place is a reminder of the fragility of that control when faced with the end of a career and the isolation of his private life. The niche remains, exactly as it was when the bronze door was sealed, yet the silence surrounding his final years grows heavier with time. The records are settled, but the story of the man remains unfinished. From the quiet isolation of a director's private plot, we travel to a hillside in Glendale, where a young actress found a finality she did not seek in life. Peg Entwistle is remembered less for her stage performances than for her decision in 1932 to climb a maintenance ladder to the top of the Hollywoodland sign and take her own life, a death that transformed her into an accidental icon of the industry's crushing indifference. Her body was discovered in the brush below the letter H, and while her death was ruled a suicide, the aftermath of her burial remains remarkably sparse. She was laid to rest in Oak Hill Cemetery in Glendale, Ohio, far from the neon lights of Los Angeles, in a grave marked by a simple, weathered headstone that bears her name and dates. The official records are clear about the location, yet the grave itself has become a site of uneasy pilgrimage for those obsessed with the dark side of fame. Visitors often leave small bouquets, theater programs, or notes tucked against the granite, seeking a connection to a woman who left behind almost no trace of her own intentions. The story took a strange turn decades later, when urban legends began to circulate, claiming that her ghost haunted the hiking trails beneath the sign, a rumor fueled by the uncanny nature of her demise. While historians point to the lack of evidence for any such spectral presence, the persistent reports of a woman in 30s-era clothing near the hillside continue to surface in local folklore. What has never been proven is whether Entwistle intended for her final act to be a statement on her failed career or a desperate exit from a life that had become untenable. But the tragedy became inseparable from the physical space she occupied. A single rusted metal letter now stands in the archives as a grim reminder of the mechanism of her exit, while her headstone remains quiet, etched with a name that is now more famous than it ever was during her short time on the stage. The funeral ended in a small, private ceremony, but the story of the girl who jumped into history did not. The grave is still there, the answer is not. A descent from the Hollywood sign leads directly to the quiet, mahogany-lined interior of the Chapel of the Chimes in Oakland, California, where the final resting place of George Reeves is found. Best known to the world as the television incarnation of Superman, his career was defined by an indestructible persona that contrasted sharply with the findings of the 1959 police investigation, which ruled his death a self-inflicted act. While the official record remains closed, the site of his burial has become a focal point for those who reject the conclusion reached by investigators decades ago. His remains are housed in a niche within a columbarium, marked by a bronze plaque that lists his name and the dates of his life, yet the space feels perpetually unsettled by the shadow of the events in his Benedict Canyon home. For years, rumors have persisted that the forensic evidence did not align with the narrative of his final moments, prompting amateur investigators to treat the niche as a site of unresolved inquiry rather than closure. Unlike the typical graves of screen legends, which are often adorned with flowers or fan letters, the space around his remains is characterized by a lingering, cold speculation about missing fingerprints and conflicting testimonies from those present on the night he died. The official files are yellowed and archived, yet they are frequently reopened by those who argue that a man cast as an icon of invincible strength could not have met his end in the manner described by the authorities. Visitors often stare at the polished stone, searching for a sign that the official account is flawed, yet the niche offers only silence. The paradox remains that the man who embodied a character synonymous with truth and justice is interred in a place where the truth is considered by many to be buried alongside him. The funeral was held, the casket was sealed, and the records were filed in triplicate. Yet the circumstances of his passing continue to be debated with the same intensity as the day the news broke. The bronze plaque remains exactly where it was placed, holding a name that still invites questions no one can answer. The mystery is not in the grave, but in the distance between the record and the reality. Where some legends leave behind only a hollow legend, Dalida leaves behind a literal monument to her own public projection, located at the Cimetière de Montmartre in Paris. The singer, who defined the chanson française for decades with a voice that seemed to vibrate with both triumph and irreparable loneliness, was found dead in her home in 1987, following an act of self-harm. She was laid to rest in a plot that stands as one of the most visited sites in the cemetery, dominated by a life-sized bronze sculpture of the performer herself. This statue depicts her standing with an arched back and outstretched arms, a frozen, golden-hued echo of her stage presence that towers over the modest granite slab where she actually lies. The grave is perpetually covered in fresh roses and handwritten notes, but the focus of the site remains the sculpture, which has been polished to a shimmering finish by the palms of thousands of grieving fans who touch the bronze in a ritualistic search for connection. While the official cemetery records document her interment in the family plot, the physical reality of the grave is constantly obscured by the deliberate artistry of the monument. There is a persistent, quiet tension between the woman who suffered in private and the icon who was literally cast in metal to survive the decay of the earth. Local caretakers often speak of the way the light hits the statue in the late afternoon, casting a shadow that stretches long and thin across the gravel paths, making the bronze figure appear as if it might step off its pedestal at any moment. The official narrative is one of a star who chose her own final exit, but the grave itself is designed to deny that finality, presenting a version of Dalida that is forever young, forever dramatic, and forever performing. People still travel to this specific corner of the cemetery, not to visit a grave in the traditional, somber sense, but to stand in the presence of an image that refuses to acknowledge its own permanence. The funeral ended in 1987, and the mourners eventually left the gates, but the bronze woman has remained in her eternal, silent pose ever since. The grave is still there, and the thousands of hands that touch the cold metal every year ensure that the surface never truly settles into the stillness of a memorial. While the French singer Dalida rests in a tomb of white stone beneath a life-size sculpture of herself, Jeanne Seberg lies in a much quieter corner of Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris, marked by a simple slab that belies the decade of state-sponsored surveillance and deep psychological distress that preceded her 1979 death. The official ruling regarding her passing was a probable suicide, yet the circumstances surrounding the discovery of her remains in the back of a white Renault parked on a side street for 11 days, sparked immediate and enduring suspicion among her inner circle. While the autopsy confirmed the presence of a lethal amount of barbiturates and alcohol, Seberg's family publicly blamed the relentless harassment by the FBI, who had targeted the actress for her political associations and civil rights activism, for driving her to such a state. At the cemetery, her grave remains modest, bearing the dates of her life and her name, a stark contrast to the global fame she achieved as the pixie-haired star of the French New Wave. For years, visitors have left small tokens, worn photographs, single lilies, and handwritten notes atop the cold gray granite, but the physical reality of the grave has often been overshadowed by the mystery of her final days. The official account of the investigation was closed, yet the files detailing the government's efforts to discredit her remained heavily redacted for decades, fueling a persistent belief that the full extent of the psychological pressure placed upon her was intentionally buried alongside her. There are no grand monuments here, no gilded statues, only the silence of a Parisian burial plot tucked away from the main thoroughfares. What is written on the stone is fixed and factual, but the story of how she arrived at that Renault and why her life became a target of such extreme institutional focus remains a subject of intense historical debate. The cemetery records show the location of the plot, but they cannot account for the missing pieces of her narrative that her family fought to expose for years after the funeral rites were concluded. The grave is still there, tucked into the rose of Montparnasse, a static point in a life defined by movement and sudden, violent stillness. The answer to whether her end was merely a tragedy or a calculated destruction is not etched into the stone, and it likely never will be. From the cold, concrete containment of a French police van, we turn to a sprawling hillside in California, where the final act of the Mexican Spitfire remains shrouded in as much speculation as her life. Lupe Velez, a woman whose frenetic energy defined the screen in the 1930s and 40s, was found dead in her Hollywood home in 1944. The official ruling cited an overdose of barbiturates, but the narrative surrounding her death quickly morphed into a sensationalized legend involving a floral arrangement and a floor-length evening gown. Her remains were initially interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, but the site was not the final destination for a woman whose life had been characterized by constant motion. In 1947, her body was exhumed and transported to Panteón Civil de Dolores in Mexico City, a move that sparked decades of debate regarding her true intentions and the handling of her estate. The gravestone in Mexico is modest, often overlooked by the grander mausoleums nearby, yet it serves as the focal point for a persistent, stubborn rumor that suggests her death was not the solitary event the papers claimed. While the medical examiner provided a clear cause, local lore insists that the scene of her death was staged, creating a theatrical exit that matched the persona she had meticulously crafted for the cameras. Visitors occasionally leave small offerings of dried flowers or theater tickets at the Mexican plot, acknowledging the performer rather than the victim. Yet the discrepancy between the Hollywood autopsy and the quiet reality of her relocation leaves a gap in the historical record that historians have struggled to bridge. There is a tangible tension between the official burial records kept in Glendale and the public narrative that grew around her final, private moments. The casket was moved, the files were sealed, and the public was left with a collection of conflicting reports that have never been reconciled. The stone marks the location of the physical remains, but the version of events that persists in the public imagination refuses to stay buried in the earth. The grave sits under the heavy shade of the Panteón trees, silent and immovable, while the truth of her final night remains as fragmented as the scripts she once brought to life. The star who found her final rest in a cemetery far from the Italian sun is Pier Angeli, whose remains were laid to rest at the Cimetière des Boulevis in Rueil-Malmaison, France, following her death in 1971. Known for her delicate features and a high-profile romance with James Dean that haunted her public image long after it ended, her life concluded in a quiet apartment in Beverly Hills. The official ruling by the Los Angeles County coroner determined that her death was caused by an accidental overdose of barbiturates, a conclusion that remains the subject of quiet debate among those who closely followed her struggles with depression and the pressures of her later career. While many icons of the silver screen are interred in the sprawling, manicured gardens of Forest Lawn, Angeli was moved to the outskirts of Paris, a choice that underscored a desire for distance from the Hollywood machine that had consumed her youth. Her grave is marked by a simple, weathered stone, an object that appears starkly modest when contrasted with the elaborate mausoleums of her contemporaries. Visitors often leave small tokens or fresh flowers, yet the site remains largely overlooked by the general public, a solitude that matches the final chapter of her life. There is a persistent, unsubstantiated rumor that her burial was intended to be temporary and that her family had once considered transferring her remains back to her native Italy, though no records exist to support this claim. The cemetery remains a quiet corner of the French suburbs, largely unchanged by the passage of decades. Her marker bears her birth name, Anna Maria Pierangeli, a gesture that seems to reclaim an identity stripped away by the demands of the studio system. The official account of her burial is clear, verified by civil records and the quiet oversight of the local authorities in Rueil-Malmaison. Yet, the story of her final movement, from the chaos of California to the stillness of France, continues to frame the way her life is remembered. She sought an escape from the lens of the public eye in life, and in the quiet of this French cemetery, she finally achieved a silence that the cameras could never grant her. The grave is still there. The answer to her final, private struggles remains firmly buried beneath the earth. The grief that claimed Pierangeli left behind a vacuum that Charles Boyer inhabited for only 2 days before he took his own life in 1978. Yet the quiet marble of his final resting place remains a point of persistent contention for those who track the history of Hollywood's golden age. Known as the quintessential romantic lead, the man who defined the smooth, continental lover on the silver screen ended his life in a parked car, leaving behind a legacy that felt as carefully constructed as his public persona. He was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, interred in a family crypt that houses both his wife and his son. The site is marked by a modest, upright slab of gray stone that catches the late afternoon light, though it is the proximity of these 3 names that fuels the melancholy fascination of those who visit. While cemetery records confirm the official sequence of the interments, the atmosphere of the site is frequently clouded by the persistent, unverified rumor that the family plot was designed with specific, unconventional structural modifications to ensure the remains would never be disturbed or relocated, a claim that the cemetery administration has never confirmed nor addressed. The grave is adorned with simple, fresh floral arrangements that seem to change with the seasons. Yet the stone itself bears no elaborate flourishes or grand tributes to the actor's extensive filmography. Instead, the focus remains entirely on the familial cluster, a design choice that observers often interpret as an attempt to assert a sense of domestic permanence that eluded him in his final hours. The official account of his death is a matter of clear, documented medical record, yet visitors often linger near the plot to debate whether the arrangement of the names implies a deliberate severance from the industry that made him famous. An ivory-colored ceramic vase often sits at the base of the marker, standing out against the muted tones of the stone, acting as a small, fragile anchor in a location where the heavy, silent weight of the crypt door is meant to signify an ending. The funeral services concluded decades ago, but the speculation regarding the exact placement of his remains within the family wall continues to draw quiet attention. The grave remains accessible, but the truth of his final intentions is buried behind the stone. From the shadowed corners of Hollywood's golden age, where the light of the studio lamp often flickered out long before the final curtain, we find Clara Blandick, a woman whose face was known to millions as the stern but loving Aunt Em in The Wizard of Oz. Her final act was a calculated departure from the screen, occurring in April 1962, when she chose to end her own life in her Hollywood apartment. The official ruling was suicide, an act performed with the meticulousness of a stage direction, as she left behind a note stating she was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life. She was cremated shortly after, and her ashes were interred at the Great Mausoleum in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Yet, unlike the vibrant, sepia-toned prairie of her most famous role, her resting place is marked by a quiet, often overlooked plaque. Visitors who seek out the site of a performer who defined the American family home are frequently struck by the stark anonymity of the location. There is no large monument, no cinematic flourish, and little to suggest the woman who once anchored one of the most beloved films in history lies behind the cold marble. For decades, the records at Forest Lawn have confirmed her presence in a niche, yet fans often remark on the disconnect between her household name and the relative silence surrounding her final address. The official record is clear, but the mystery persists in the public imagination, which often struggles to reconcile the image of a comforting, maternal figure with the solitary finality of her end. She left behind a career that helped build the foundations of American cinema, but her transition into the archives of the mausoleum was performed in private, without the fanfare of a premiere or the comfort of a cast. The plaque remains, a simple bronze plate holding a name that continues to echo through generations of film lovers, yet it offers no explanation for why such a familiar face felt compelled to leave the stage so abruptly. The funeral ended, the records were filed, and the urn was placed, but the quiet that surrounds her remains as heavy today as it was on that morning in 1962. The grave is still there. The answer is not. The star who once demanded recognition before it was fashionable, Florence Lawrence, met an end that left her name erased from the very industry she helped build. Known as the Biograph Girl, she was the first movie star to be identified by name, transitioning from a household face to a forgotten specter within a single decade. In 1938, after years of physical pain and professional decline, her life reached its conclusion through the ingestion of an ant poison compound, a death ruled a suicide by the authorities of the time. For nearly 40 years, her remains lay in an unmarked grave at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, stripped of the celebrity she had pioneered. There was no headstone to mark the ground, no record of her contribution to the birth of the feature film, and for decades, even the staff at the cemetery struggled to pinpoint the exact coordinates of her final resting place. It was not until 1991 that the silent injustice was rectified by a donation from a film actor who felt the oversight was a stain on the history of cinema. A marker was finally placed, engraved with the words, "The First Movie Star," yet the decades of anonymity created a lingering, uncomfortable silence around her legacy. The official burial records are now secure, but the indignity of those 40 years of obscurity remains a jarring counterpoint to her fame. Visitors sometimes leave small, vintage film canisters or coins at the base of the granite slab, attempting to bridge the gap between her massive influence and the years her identity was completely misplaced. There is a profound dissonance in the fact that a woman who insisted on being known during her life was forced into such a long, total erasure after her death. The cemetery records now confirm she occupies a space that is accounted for, mapped, and cataloged. Yet for those who trace the history of the early screen, the absence of her name for so long suggests that the industry she helped create was remarkably quick to look away. The stone is now solid and permanent, a fixed point in the earth, but it serves as a reminder of how easily the light of early Hollywood was extinguished, leaving only a cold, quiet marker in a crowded city of ghosts, where the search for recognition often ends in the dirt. While some figures find their final rest in the manicured silence of public gardens, the director Tony Scott, known for the relentless kinetic energy of his films, left the world in a way that left his family and the public searching for a permanence that remained elusive. Following his death in 2012 by jumping from the Vincent Thomas Bridge in Los Angeles, the industry expected a high-profile memorial or a plot in one of the grand cemeteries favored by Hollywood elite. Instead, the final arrangements were kept exceptionally private. Tony Scott was cremated, and his ashes were interred at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, a place synonymous with the spectacle of film history. Yet his marker is notably understated, tucked away in the Garden of Legends. The official report from the Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner Coroner concluded that the death was a result of self-inflicted injuries, a ruling that stood in stark contrast to the speculation that circulated in the months following his sudden absence. Despite the official closure provided by the interment, persistent rumors regarding his state of mind at the time of the event continued to overshadow the physical reality of his grave. Visitors to the plot often note the simplicity of the bronze plaque, which lacks the bombast associated with his visual style, or the massive scale of his productions. There is an uneasy tension between the site and the man. The cemetery records confirm the location, yet the secrecy surrounding the immediate aftermath of his death fueled a narrative that the public version of his final days was incomplete. For years, theories surfaced suggesting that health struggles, which had not been publicly disclosed, were the primary motivation, a claim that his representatives vehemently denied. The grave itself remains a point of quiet pilgrimage for those who admire his work, yet it offers none of the answers regarding the internal quiet he sought. The bronze marker sits flush against the earth, a heavy, silent object that provides a container for remains but no resolution for the lingering questions of why a man who spent his life crafting perfect, explosive endings would choose such a definitive, quiet exit. The records remain sealed, the site remains accessible, and the curiosity regarding the final transition from the bridge to the cemetery has never fully dissipated. The grave is still there. The answer is not. From the bridge of a ship to a quiet home in North Hollywood, the path of a life can end in a single, irreversible moment that leaves the living to navigate the silence of a memorial. Lee Thompson Young was a face familiar to a generation of television viewers, known for his portrayal of a teenage hero, yet his story concluded in 2013 when he died by suicide. Following his passing, his remains were interred at Inglewood Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, California. The grave itself is marked by a simple, dignified headstone, yet for those who seek out his final resting place, the experience is defined by the contrast between the vibrant, youthful character he played on screen and the stillness of the cemetery grounds. While his career was defined by optimism and energy, the official records of his passing were marked by the clinical finality of a coroner's report, closing the book on a life that had moved from the spotlight of a children's network to the private corridors of adult struggle. Visitors to Inglewood Park often leave small tokens, flowers, or letters tucked against the stone, a habit born from the parasocial intimacy created by long-running television programs. Yet the cemetery remains a place of rigid order. What makes this gravesite a point of enduring conversation is not a mystery of a missing body or a stolen monument, but the persistent dissonance between the public's perception of a young star and the reality of his departure. The official account of his death remains undisputed by historians and legal authorities, standing as a matter of public record that requires no further investigation. Despite this, the internet remains populated by fan-driven speculation regarding the specific pressures of his environment, theories that seek a narrative explanation for a tragedy that provided none. The headstone bears his name and the dates that bookend his existence, a marker intended to provide closure in a physical space. The funeral rites were concluded, the soil was turned, and the records were filed away in government archives. Yet, the story refused to settle for the audience, who continue to return to the memory of his work, looking for clues in old scripts that were never meant to be read as final chapters. The grave is still there. The answer is not. While the echoes of other tragic departures linger in the public imagination, the final resting place of Mary Kay Bergman remains a quiet, private sanctuary that stands in stark contrast to the chaotic, high-energy world of the characters she brought to life. Known to millions as the voice behind multiple iconic residents of South Park, Bergman was the force that gave rhythm and identity to a vast roster of animated personalities, yet her own voice was silenced in 1999 following an official ruling of suicide. She was interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, California, a place where the rolling, manicured hills offer a muted backdrop to the thousands of markers embedded in the grass. Her grave is marked by a modest plaque, a simple bronze plate, that identifies her by her legal name, Mary Kay Bergman French, and the dates of her life. While other figures in the industry are immortalized with elaborate mausoleums or statues that invite constant pilgrimage, Bergman's site is often overlooked by the casual visitor, tucked away in a section of the cemetery that emphasizes collective rest over individual celebrity. There is no grand sculpture here, only a name set against the soil, a detail that feels almost dissonant given the explosive vibrancy of her professional output. The official burial records are straightforward, documenting the transition from her sudden loss to this specific plot. Yet fans who seek out the location often find themselves struck by the anonymity of the setting. It is a place that refuses to lean into the spectacle of her fame, maintaining a silence that feels deliberate. Visitors sometimes leave small tokens, a pen, a sketch, or a quiet note. But the site lacks the frantic energy that usually surrounds those who leave the spotlight in such abrupt fashion. The discrepancy between the voice that defined a generation and the quiet, immovable bronze marker in the grass is the defining feature of her memorial. The funeral ended, but the realization of how much silence she left behind continues to settle over the plot. The plaque is still there, polished and unchanging, but the person who once occupied the space between the silence and the sound has long since moved beyond the reach of the living. From the quiet solitude of an unmarked niche to the sprawling manicured lawn of a suburban cemetery, the finality of death often fails to provide the silence that those who suffer in life crave. Ray Combs, the energetic, high-stepping host of Family Feud who bridged the gap between game show tradition and a new, faster era of television, ended his life in 1996 following a series of profound personal and professional crises. His death was ruled a suicide by the authorities in Glendale, California, after a period of intense public struggle that had already seen him step away from the spotlight. He was laid to rest at the Glendale Forest Lawn Memorial Park, a place known for its carefully curated vistas and the celebrity status of its permanent residents. The marker is modest, a flat bronze plaque set flush into the manicured turf, which allows the maintenance crews to pass over it without obstruction. This anonymity is precisely what draws the curious to his plot, as fans often struggle to find the exact coordinates amidst the thousands of other markers in the section. The official records are clear regarding the location of his remains, yet the internet remains flooded with threads from people who claim they visited the cemetery only to be unable to locate the grave, leading to persistent, unfounded rumors that his family chose to move the headstone or that the site was altered to prevent vandalism from obsessed viewers. These claims arise from a misunderstanding of the sprawling, labyrinthine layout of the grounds rather than any factual mystery. The grave is not a site of public spectacle. It is a quiet, unassuming rectangle of earth that serves as a stark contrast to the bright, loud, and brightly lit studio stages where he spent the final years of his career. People continue to visit, leaving behind small, singular items, sometimes a game show buzzer, sometimes just a fading photograph, which are cleared away by the groundskeepers with the same efficiency they apply to the grass. The funeral concluded within the standard rites of his faith, yet the questions about the pressure of fame and the fragility of a public persona remained hanging in the air. The grave is still there. The answer to the public's enduring fascination with his departure is not. The silence left by a game show host is rarely as heavy as the quiet that followed the departure of Brian Keith, whose final resting place at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles remains a study in understated permanence. Known to audiences as the rugged, bearded uncle in Family Affair and a versatile character actor who spent decades occupying the background of American cinema, Keith faced a private battle with depression and a terminal diagnosis in 1997. Following the official ruling of suicide by a self-inflicted gunshot wound, his interment was swift and quiet, contrasting sharply with the loud, public lives of the Hollywood icons, buried just feet away in the same crowded cemetery. His marker is a simple, flat bronze plaque set into the manicured lawn, a modest rectangle that often disappears beneath the shadows of larger, more ostentatious monuments. While the cemetery records confirm his presence in the earth, there remains a persistent, quiet friction regarding his legacy, as his death occurred only months after the loss of his own daughter to similar circumstances, a detail that turned his final plot into a site of uncomfortable public speculation. Visitors often find the grave by tracing the names of his more famous neighbors, yet they frequently overlook the specific bronze letters of his name, which have begun to weather under the Southern California sun. What remains in question is not whether he is truly there, but why his departure seemed to close a chapter on a specific brand of television masculinity that the public was not ready to surrender. There is no grand mausoleum, no sculpture of his likeness, and no elaborate funerary ritual to mark his passing. There is only the grass and the flat, cold metal, The official account says the matter is settled, yet the proximity of his final resting place to the bustling, noisy streets of the city suggests a lack of the peace he was searching for in his final hours. The marker is still there, flush with the ground, holding the weight of a name that people still recognize, though they often forget why they are standing there at all. The funeral ended in 1997. The story of why he chose to leave remains, like the plaque itself, firmly pressed into the dirt. The silence left by Brian Keith is matched only by the quiet finality surrounding Richard Farnsworth, whose departure in 2000 was as stark and understated as the roles he played throughout his long career as a veteran stuntman and character actor. While his performance in The Straight Story earned him an Academy Award nomination that made him a household name in his final year, the end of his life was dictated by a terminal illness he chose not to endure to its conclusion. Following the official ruling of suicide at his ranch in Lincoln, New Mexico, his remains were not placed in a sprawling celebrity mausoleum or a public monument designed for visitation. Instead, he was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, California, beneath a modest marker that sits flush with the manicured grass, indistinguishable from the thousands of others surrounding it. There is no elaborate sculpture here, no ornate ironwork to draw the eye, and no specific object left behind by a crowd of mourning fans. The lack of a grand tribute is perhaps the most striking aspect of the site. It stands in direct opposition to the immense, late-blooming fame he achieved during his final months of life. While the official cemetery records provide the exact location of his plot, the simplicity of the site has led to a persistent, quiet confusion among those who travel there expecting a more prominent display for a man who had become a symbol of quiet endurance on the silver screen. Some visitors express surprise at the lack of ceremony, searching for a sign that confirms this is the final resting place of a man who held the attention of millions just weeks before his death. The transition from the public spotlight of an awards season to the absolute stillness of a flat stone grave is the defining tension of his final chapter. The official account says he found peace in the solitude of the desert before returning to the hills of Los Angeles to be buried. The story did not end with the closing of the casket, as the disparity between his quiet burial and his loud, sudden fame remains a point of contemplation for those who find their way to the row. The grave is still there. The answer is not. From the quiet, earth-toned marker of a legendary character actor, we move to the dense, unforgiving woods of Stanley Park in Vancouver, where the final days of Andrew Koenig, an actor known for his role on Growing Pains, concluded in 2010. While many celebrities are interred in manicured gardens of marble and granite, Koenig's final resting place is not a conventional plot behind iron gates, but a specific, remote area of forest where he was discovered after a long and public search. His passing was ruled a suicide by the local authorities, a conclusion that brought a sudden, quiet end to a frantic search that had gripped both the entertainment industry and the public. Because the location was a natural site rather than a traditional cemetery, there is no headstone to read, no visitors' register to sign, and no stone path worn down by pilgrims. Instead, his family chose to scatter a portion of his ashes in a place that held personal significance, effectively removing his remains from the reach of the curious and the public eye. This creates a persistent tension between the desire for private grief and the public's habit of turning locations of tragedy into sites of pilgrimage. Fans who search for a tangible monument find only the shifting landscape of the park, which retains no marks of the events that occurred beneath its canopy. The official records confirm his death and the location of his recovery. Yet the absence of a permanent marker leaves a void where the physical narrative usually settles. It is a stark contrast to the industry that relied on his image and presence. Here, the image has been replaced by the landscape itself, which guards the site with indifference. The park remains, the trees grow, and the exact coordinates of his resting point are known only to those closest to him, effectively ending the public story at the edge of the woods. The absence of a grave means there is no place to leave a flower, no surface to touch, and no date to carve in stone. The search ended the moment he was found, but the lack of a traditional monument ensures that the finality of his departure remains defined by what is missing rather than what is displayed. A different kind of silence settled over the East River in the winter of 2004, leaving behind a narrative that refused to resolve for months after the official ruling of death by suicide. Spalding Gray, the monologist known for turning his own neuroses and existential anxieties into hypnotic, bare-bones theater, disappeared into the cold currents of the water, yet his remains did not emerge for over 2 months. Because of this interval, the recovery of his body near a ferry terminal in New York City became the final, grim chapter of a life spent dissecting personal history. He was cremated, and today there is no traditional headstone or public plot for followers to visit, as his ashes were scattered by his family. This absence of a physical anchor point is perhaps the most fitting end for a man who spent his career arguing that truth was merely a performance of memory. While other performers have marble monuments or bronze plaques to demarcate their final resting places, Gray's legacy remains tethered to the ambiguity of the water that held him. For years, listeners who had sat in rapt silence during his performances found themselves searching for a grave that simply did not exist. There is no marker in a cemetery to verify the ending, no stone to weather, and no soil to press a hand against. Instead, the story of his final months is one of unfinished business, where the lack of a grave forces the audience to confront the monologue he never got to finish. People still walk the banks of the river where he was eventually found, looking for a sign that isn't there, trying to reconcile the man who mapped his entire interior life with a death that left nothing behind but a name in a record book. The official reports are complete, and the legal proceedings ended long ago, but the public curiosity persists, precisely because there is no place to lay a flower or leave a token. He remains a voice in the dark, a storyteller who exited the stage so completely that he left no physical evidence of his departure. The search for a resolution stops at the water's edge, where the current continues to move, and the grave remains an empty space in the mind of his audience. From the quiet waters of the Hudson where one man slipped away, we turn to the stark, color-drenched silence of a studio in New York City, where the official ruling of suicide in 1970 silenced one of the 20th century's most profound painters. Mark Rothko, known for massive canvases that vibrate with the weight of human emotion, left behind a legacy of intensity that seemed to follow him into the earth. He is buried in Eastchester at the Ferncliff Cemetery, resting within the serene confines of a mausoleum that stands in sharp contrast to the chaotic, layered turbulence of his work. While the cemetery records are clear and his final resting place is documented as a vault within the Rosewood Mausoleum, the physical reality of his interment is often overshadowed by the legal and spiritual battles that defined his estate in the years immediately following his death. The transition from life to the cold marble of the crypt was not the end of the conflict, as his executors and children became entangled in a decade-long dispute over the ownership and integrity of the thousands of paintings he left behind. The public, drawn to the emotional depth of his color fields, often seeks a more visceral connection to the artist than a simple plaque in a suburban mausoleum can provide, leading to a strange disconnect between the man who died and the myths that grew in the wake of his passing. There are no flowers left by strangers on a simple headstone, for he lies behind locked doors, out of reach, protected by the very institution of the cemetery that keeps his physical presence as contained as his paintings were expansive. Official accounts verify the location of his remains, yet the narrative surrounding his departure remains permanently unsettled by the lawsuits that sought to dismantle his legacy, suggesting that while the body was laid to rest, the artist was effectively put on trial for years afterward. The silence of the mausoleum is absolute, yet it does little to dampen the persistent feeling among scholars that the true resting place of Mark Rothko is not in the ground of a New York cemetery, but in the unresolved tension of the work he left behind. The tomb is accounted for. The struggle for what he created, however, remains a ghost that refuses to be buried. The quiet finality of a master's canvas offers little comfort when compared to the abrupt erasure of Jean Hébuterne, whose remains now lie in a grave that was never meant to be permanent. Known to history primarily as the muse and companion of the painter Amedeo Modigliani, her life ended in 1920, just one day after he succumbed to illness. In a state of profound grief, she took her own life, leaving behind a family who viewed the artist as a corrupting influence. They buried her in the Cimetière de Bagneux in Paris, far from the man she had followed into death. For a decade, the two were kept apart by a barrier of earth and familial spite, until the artist's family finally insisted on a reunion. In 1930, her remains were exhumed and moved to the Père Lachaise Cemetery, where they were placed alongside Modigliani in a shared tomb. The marker is a simple stone structure, inscribed with the names of the couple in a way that suggests a peace they were never permitted in their short, tumultuous lifetimes. Yet, the story of her burial remains colored by the lingering resentment of her parents, who for years refused to acknowledge her choice to be buried with him. Even today, the grave attracts visitors who leave not just flowers, but tubes of paint and brushes, artifacts of an artistic devotion that persisted even after the heartbeat stopped. The official records confirm the relocation of her coffin, and the physical proximity of the two remains is documented by the cemetery administration, but the shadow of that decade of separation still hangs over the site. It is a quiet corner in a crowded, labyrinthine necropolis, where the marble surface is cold to the touch regardless of the season. Visitors often stand before the shared inscription, looking for a sign of the tragedy that prompted the original, desperate act in a freezing Parisian apartment. The record of the transfer is clear. The dates are etched into the stone, and the physical placement of the couple is a matter of administrative fact. Yet there is a persistent, quiet sense that the narrative was only corrected long after the witnesses to her pain had passed away. The grave is still there. The answer is not. The sorrow of a lost muse often lingers in the silence of an empty space. Yet for the fashion designer Loren Scott, who died by suicide in 2014, the finality of her resting place carries the weight of a long and private distance. Known as a towering figure of elegance who navigated the world of high-profile entertainment, her life ended in a Manhattan apartment, but her remains were transported across the Atlantic to be interred in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. This choice of burial ground, famous for its grand mausoleums and the resting places of cinematic icons, creates a stark contrast to the quiet, almost austere nature of her memorial. While many of the monuments surrounding her site are ornate, sculpted, and deeply public, her marker remains understated, a reflection of the private nature she maintained, despite her proximity to immense global fame. The official record confirms her interment in the Garden of Legends section, yet the story of her grave is marked by the persistent absence of the public fanfare, usually reserved for those within that specific cemetery's gates. Visitors often find the site difficult to locate among the sprawling, elaborate headstones, leading to a strange cycle of rumors regarding whether the plot was meant to be anonymous or if it simply reflects a family's desire for a seclusion that the world continues to encroach upon. The central object of this site is the simple, polished stone slab, which serves as a stark anchor for those who attempt to find closure for a life that was lived in the blinding light of the public eye. There are no grand statues here, no shifting secrets of stolen remains, and no elaborate myths regarding her physical presence. But there remains an unresolved tension between the public's desire to memorialize her work and the inherent privacy of her final location. The funeral was held in a small, closed ceremony, and the media reports of the time focused heavily on the shock of her passing. Yet the location of her remains continues to be a point of quiet scrutiny for those who track the final movements of high-profile figures. The grave is marked by a date, a name, and a silence that seems to defy the noise of her life. The burial was completed. The questions regarding the aftermath were not. The stone sits in the grass, but the narrative remains unfinished. While the fashion world mourned a sudden, quiet departure in New York, the French culinary world was reeling from a different kind of silence, left by Bernard Loiseau, a man who once stood at the absolute summit of gastronomy. In 2003, the chef who held 3 Michelin stars at his Côte d'Or restaurant in Saulieu took his own life, following a period of intense professional anxiety and public scrutiny over his restaurant's ratings. His passing was not just the end of a singular talent, but the beginning of a long, cold debate about the crushing pressure of the guidebooks that decide a kitchen's fate. Loiseau was laid to rest in the communal cemetery of Saulieu, a town that had become inseparable from his name and his craft. His grave is a modest plot, shielded from the grandiosity of his career, marked by a simple stone monument that stands as a quiet reminder of a legacy built on fragile perfection. What makes this site a point of enduring tension is not the location itself, but the lingering ghost of the criticism that surrounded his final days. While the official account cited the immense weight of keeping his culinary status, locals and peers often point to the relentless nature of the media and the industry's hunger for perfection as the true architects of his end. Visitors still leave small culinary tokens, herbs, wooden spoons, or wine corks, resting against the stone, items that speak to a man whose life was measured in ingredients and approval. The cemetery records confirm his presence in that specific plot, yet the culinary community remains unsettled. There is an unspoken agreement among the chefs who travel there that the grave represents a debt that can never be paid back, a silent protest against the industry that demanded everything from a man who had already given it. The official record closes with the date of his interment, but the story refused to end there, transforming his grave into a site of pilgrimage for those who feel the weight of their own professional expectations. The gravestone sits under the Burgundian sky, unmoving and silent, while the debate over the cost of his excellence continues to simmer in the kitchens he once ruled. The chef is resting, but the pressure that put him there remains a haunting, unresolved part of the landscape. A quiet kitchen in France yields to the stark, concrete reality of the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, where the final resting place of Valery Legasov remains as austere as the state secrets he carried to his grave in 1988. Legasov was the chief chemist who became the public face of the Chernobyl disaster, a man who spent his final months documenting the failures of a system that eventually turned its back on him. Following his death by suicide, the official state narrative initially attempted to erase his contribution, leaving him out of the history books and the public consciousness for years. His grave is marked by a simple, upright stone set among the elite of the Soviet era, yet for a long time it was ignored by those who built the very monument he helped mitigate. Visitors today leave flowers, though for decades the site remained a point of friction between those who viewed him as a hero and those who viewed him as a whistleblower who had violated his oath of silence. The cemetery records show he was buried with full honors, yet the records of his final investigation into the reactor design remained suppressed for years, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic classification that mirrored the concrete sarcophagus he helped design. The official account of his death was quick, dry, and intended to close the book on the inconvenient questions he raised about the stability of the RBMK reactors. But the story refused to settle. There are no elaborate crypts or grandiose statues here, only the cold gray stone that serves as a barrier between the man who knew too much and a history that was not yet ready to be told. The most haunting object at the site is not the headstone itself, but the lingering silence that surrounded his burial, a silence maintained by a state that feared his testimony more than his absence. His colleagues were initially denied the ability to speak openly about his findings, creating a vacuum where rumors of foul play and state intervention thrived for years. The grave is still there, tucked away in the shadows of the Russian capital, and the official report on his passing is locked in the archives, but the questions he left behind in his tapes have proven far more difficult to bury. The grave is silent, but the reactor still hums with the echoes of what he tried to tell the world. The silence left by a scientist who saw too far into the mechanics of the universe eventually leads us to the grave of Ludwig Boltzmann in the Zentralfriedhof Cemetery in Vienna. He was the man who decoded the probabilistic nature of entropy, yet the official ruling regarding his death in 1906 stands as a stark contradiction to the orderly laws he spent his life formulating. His final resting place is marked by a tall, dignified stone monument, dominated by a bust of the physicist himself, but the true focal point of the site is the large etched equation carved into the granite base, S equals K log W. This formula, defining the relationship between entropy and the number of microstates in a system, serves as his epitaph, effectively turning his gravestone into a textbook for the physics community. While the monument is impeccably maintained and remains a site of pilgrimage for students of thermodynamics, a strange dissonance persists between the man and the math. Boltzmann suffered from what was then described as severe bouts of melancholia, yet his work suggested a world governed by the relentless march toward disorder. The mystery is not whether he is truly buried beneath the heavy stone in Group 14A of the cemetery, but rather why the burden of his own intellectual discovery seemed so difficult to reconcile with a peaceful existence. For decades, visitors have traced the carved letters of his equation with their fingers, leaving behind chalk dust or small stones, treating the monument more like a laboratory station than a grave. The official account of his end in Duino, Italy, is documented, and the cemetery records confirm his interment in the city where he once taught. Yet, the irony remains that the man who proved that the universe trends toward chaos is immortalized by a structure that resists it, standing rigid and perfectly preserved in the heart of the Austrian capital. The equation remains visible to anyone walking the quiet paths of the Zentralfriedhof, a permanent mathematical anchor in a cemetery full of shifted earth and fading memories. The funeral ended in the autumn of 1906, but the debate over whether he was broken by the very laws he discovered continues to haunt the scientific community. The grave is still there. The answer is not. The shadow of the quantum physicist does not fall alone, for the man who synthesized the modern world through the invention of nylon rests in a plot that remains as stark as the chemical formulas that defined his genius. Wallace Carothers died in 1937, his life cut short by suicide in a Philadelphia hotel room just days after his 41st birthday. He is interred in the family plot at Walnut Grove Cemetery in Boonville, Missouri, a site that serves as a quiet, rural contrast to the industrial titan he helped construct. While his work transformed the global manufacturing landscape, his final resting place is marked by a modest granite headstone that carries the weight of a man who felt the pressure of his own intellect far more than the accolades of his peers. The cemetery records are precise, confirming his arrival in the soil of his hometown. Yet the isolation of the grave suggests a profound disconnect from the massive synthetic legacy he left behind. Visitors who travel to this corner of the Midwest often find a site that appears remarkably undisturbed, a stillness that stands in stark opposition to the frenetic pace of the chemical industry he pioneered. The official narrative is one of a brilliant mind eclipsed by private despair, a conclusion reached by his colleagues and family in the immediate aftermath of his death. Yet, the story has never fully settled for those who study his life. They point to the sudden, irreversible nature of his final act as an anomaly in a career defined by slow, methodical refinement. There is no complex mythology surrounding his remains, no rumors of grave robbing or missing caskets, only the quiet, unsettling reality of a man who mastered the molecular structure of the world, but could not find the stability to remain within it. A single, weathered stone serves as the anchor for a life that changed everything from toothbrushes to parachutes. Yet here, beneath the Missouri sky, the complexity of his existence is reduced to dates and a surname. The funeral ended in the spring of 1937, but the questions regarding the burden of his brilliance continue to follow his name. The grave remains a site of historical fact, but the true internal landscape of the man who died there is a territory that no visitor can truly reach. The stone is still there. The answer is not. The search for a perfect death led Yukio Mishima to a military headquarters in 1970. Yet the search for his physical remains leads to a far more conventional plot in a quiet suburban cemetery. The man who spent his life aestheticizing violence and obsession ended his career with a public ritual suicide that shocked the Japanese government and left his followers reeling. The official record of his death is clinical, noting the conclusion of his life at the Ichigaya garrison. But the story of his interment offers a stark, chilling contrast to the high drama of his final act. He is buried at Tama-Reien Cemetery in Fuchu, Tokyo, marked by a plain, weathered stone that bears only his family name, a sharp departure from the flamboyant public persona he cultivated during his rise to literary fame. Visitors looking for a monument to his radical politics or his aesthetic theories are often disappointed to find a site that appears almost indistinguishable from the thousands of others surrounding it. There is a persistent, gnawing irony in the simplicity of this marker. While Mishima spent his final years demanding grand gestures and national transformation, his body occupies a plot of earth that requires careful navigation to locate, hidden away behind a simple iron fence that offers no hint of the man's violent departure. Cemetery records confirm the date and location of his burial, yet legends persist among his admirers that his remains were never fully settled, or that his true final resting place is held in secret by those who still worship his ideology. These rumors remain entirely unproven, surfacing whenever a new generation rediscovers his work, turning the site into a pilgrimage point for those who cannot accept that such a volcanic life could result in such a silent, static end. The grave is kept clean, often adorned with a single white flower or a small glass of sake left by a visitor who has traveled to witness the quietude of a man who could never find it in himself. The official account stands firm, documenting the burial of a man who orchestrated his own departure as a spectacle of fire and steel. But the reality of the grave remains a testament to the fact that even the most defiant spirits eventually succumb to the anonymity of the soil. The grave is still there. The answer is not. While the sword-wielding nationalist Yukio Mishima sought to carve his legacy into the very history of the state, Osamu Dazai chose to dissolve into the water, leaving behind a grave that remains a site of perpetual, uncomfortable friction. In June 1948, the author of No Longer Human was found in the Tama River alongside a woman, both having died by drowning. The official ruling was suicide, though the circumstances surrounding their final moments have fueled decades of literary speculation and conspiracy. He is interred at Zenrin-ji Temple in Mitaka, Tokyo, where his grave is marked by a simple, weathered stone that bears his pen name, yet the site is rarely quiet. Every year on June 19th, known to his devotees as Cherry Festival Day, the small plot is buried under an avalanche of fresh cherries, cigarettes, and sake, left by readers who claim a kinship with his profound existential exhaustion. The temple records verify his burial, but the site serves as a lightning rod for the unresolved tension between his public persona as a tormented genius and the private reality of his final days. The most persistent rumor, one that refuses to fade despite the official forensic reports, suggests that the discovery of the bodies was not as simple as the police logs claimed, with some scholars still hunting for discrepancies in the sequence of events that led to that riverbank. For those who visit, the grave is less a place of rest and more a repository for the guilt of the living, who use the offerings to conduct a silent dialogue with a man who spent his career documenting his own detachment from the world. A small brass incense burner sits near the base, its surface worn smooth by the touch of thousands of fingers reaching out to bridge the gap between their own suffering and his. The official account says he found his peace in the dark currents of the water, but the persistent presence of the cherries implies that, for his readers, the funeral was merely a starting point. The grave is still there, tucked away in the quiet of a temple garden, holding a name that has become synonymous with the fragility of the human spirit, while the truth of what transpired under the bridge remains submerged in the silt of the riverbed. While the writer in the park was found only after the thaw, Vladimir Mayakovsky ensured his final exit was as public and stage-managed as his revolutionary verse. In April 1930, the man who had become the thundering voice of the Soviet avant-garde died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound in his Moscow apartment, leaving behind a note that declared the love boat had crashed against the daily grind. The official ruling was suicide, yet for decades, the circumstances of his death were whispered over by those who found the geometry of the crime scene inconsistent with his stature. His body was cremated, an act that stripped the funeral of the traditional religious rites he had spent his career mocking, and his ashes were eventually moved to the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. The grave is marked by a heavy, stark granite block, a monument that feels more like a piece of industrial machinery than a place of rest, often cluttered with pens, scraps of poems, and the occasional lipstick smudge left by admirers. There is a persistent, gnawing tension surrounding the site, fueled by forensic experts and historians who have long debated the placement of the weapon and the missing fingerprints on the door of his room. The cemetery records show his remains were interred with full state honors, yet the Soviet authorities were notoriously careful about controlling the narrative of his end, leading to persistent rumors that the original autopsy files were sanitized to protect the image of the perfect communist poet. Visitors looking for a definitive answer find only the cold gray stone and a silence that seems to challenge the official state account of his final moments. The object that remains most tethered to his memory is the unfinished draft of the poem he was working on when he died, a scrap of paper that serves as a haunting bookmark in a life defined by its own calculated volatility. The official record says the case was closed in 1930, but the public curiosity has never quite accepted the finality of the state report, leaving the stone to stand as a monument not just to a poet, but to a mystery that the Soviet censors could never fully bury. The grave is still there. The answer is not. Where Mayakovsky left a note, Sergei Yesenin left a mystery that has lingered over his burial plot for nearly a century. The official report states that in December 1925, the celebrated Russian poet took his own life inside a room at the Hotel Angleterre in Leningrad, yet the physical reality of his death has been debated by scholars and enthusiasts ever since the casket was lowered into the ground. He was interred at the Vagankovo Cemetery in Moscow, beneath a simple granite monument that features a bronze bust of the poet, his head slightly bowed. The grave is perpetually covered in fresh carnations and handwritten verses left by pilgrims, but the stillness of the stone belies a history of intense scrutiny. For decades, the official account of his final hours was challenged by those who pointed to the bruising on his face and the disarray of the hotel room as evidence of a state-sanctioned struggle rather than a self-inflicted act. These claims gained such traction that, in the years following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, forensic investigators were pressured to re-examine the historical records, though no exhumation of the Vagankovo plot has ever been sanctioned to provide a definitive answer. The grave itself remains a site of pilgrimage not just for lovers of his lyrical verse, but for those who reject the state-sanctioned narrative of his end. Visitors often trace the cold lines of the bronze bust, looking for a sign of the violence that some claim occurred before he was ever placed in the earth. The cemetery records show a burial conducted with the haste of a grieving era, but the archives that might hold the truth of his final struggle were kept under seal for generations. While official consensus remains anchored to the 1925 ruling, the lingering doubt has transformed the site into a monument for an unsolved enigma. The poet's body rests in the quiet soil of Moscow, but the surrounding mystery acts as a second, invisible marker that never stops drawing questions. The funeral ended in the depth of winter. The story refused to settle. The grave is still there, beneath the shadow of the Russian trees, but the answer remains buried with him, beyond the reach of the living. While Yesenin's final resting place is dominated by a towering monument of white marble, the grave of American poet Anne Sexton hides flush against the earth, though it is just as heavily marked by the hands of living strangers. She was the pioneer of confessional poetry, a writer who turned her deepest psychological agony into Pulitzer-winning art. When her death was officially ruled a suicide in 1974, the literary world assumed the final, tragic chapter of her intense public exposure had finally closed. Her ashes were buried beneath a modest, flat bronze plaque in Forest Hills Cemetery in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. The marker bears only her name and the years of her life, offering no poetic epitaph, no final revelation. For a woman who spent her career laying her private nightmares bare, the physical grave seems designed to finally enforce a boundary of permanent silence. The funeral ended, the story did not. Visitors to Forest Hills soon began transforming the flat bronze plate into an altar of the intimately mundane, leaving behind typewritten poems, whiskey miniatures, and unlit cigarettes. Cemetery records confirm that groundskeepers frequently have to clear the sheer volume of personal debris. But what cannot be easily scrubbed away is the thick, waxy residue of red lipstick. Admirers routinely kneel to kiss the cold bronze, leaving bright, overlapping smears directly across her name. This physical invasion of her final physical space mirrors the fierce posthumous controversy surrounding her wider legacy. Years after she was put in the ground, Sexton's psychiatrist and her own family released the audio tapes of her private therapy sessions, effectively exhuming her mind for public consumption. Historians and medical ethicists still bitterly disagree over whether this was a vital literary revelation or a profound violation of the dead. At the cemetery, That same uncomfortable tension between reverence and intrusion plays out every single week. Fans believe the lipstick prints and the discarded cigarettes are beautiful tributes to a woman who made brilliant art out of her own destruction. Local observers argue the grave of someone who took her own life should simply be left alone, rather than treated as an interactive shrine to her mental illness. The official account says Anne Sexton is resting quietly in the Boston soil. The bright red stains on the bronze suggest the public still refuses to let her sleep. While Anne Sexton rests beneath a quiet stone in Massachusetts, across the Atlantic, in a windswept English churchyard, lies a grave that has been treated less like a memorial and more like a battlefield. Sylvia Plath was a poet of piercing, unsparing brilliance, a writer who spent her short career dissecting her own despair with clinical precision. In 1963, her death in London was officially ruled a suicide, abruptly ending her life at the age of 30. That tragic ruling should have been the final chapter, but it only marked the beginning of a relentless posthumous war. She was buried far from her native America, in the ancient, sprawling cemetery of St. Thomas a Becket in Heptonstall, West Yorkshire. Visitors still hike the steep cobbled streets to reach her isolated plot, leaving behind a very specific kind of offering. They push ink pens deep into the dark soil. They leave loose change, handwritten letters, and half-burnt candles along the edges of the flat stone marker. Yet the real focus of this site is the conflict carved directly into the rock. The stone bears the name Sylvia Plath Hughes. Her estranged husband, the poet Ted Hughes, inherited her literary estate and chose the final inscription. Legions of readers believed he was ultimately responsible for her mental collapse, and they refused to let his surname stand over her body. For decades, furious visitors brought chisels, hammers, and wire brushes to the quiet cemetery. They physically hacked and scraped the word Hughes off the granite face. Cemetery records show the stone was repeatedly repaired and the name repeatedly erased. At one point, the vandalism became so severe that the marker was removed entirely. The famous poet's grave sat unmarked and anonymous for years, while church officials and the estate debated how to secure the site. The official account maintains the grave is a private family resting place. Fans insist it is a monument to a woman silenced by the man whose name she was forced to carry in death. The funeral ended in the freezing rain of a Yorkshire winter, but the dispute refused to settle. Today, the headstone is back, with the full married name deeply engraved once more to resist the chisels. The pens pile up in the mud. The name remains intact. The anger at the edge of the grave has never died. From the frozen grave of Sylvia Plath, we move to the riverbed, where Virginia Woolf chose to end her life in 1941, leaving behind a legacy that has no physical tomb to contain it. The novelist who pioneered the stream of consciousness style disappeared into the River Ouse near her home in Rodmell, Sussex, and her body was not recovered until 3 weeks later. While there is no traditional grave to visit, her ashes were scattered beneath 2 elm trees in the garden of Monk's House, a place where she had lived and worked for decades. The official ruling of her death was suicide by drowning, yet the absence of a headstone or a marked plot has fueled a persistent, quiet restlessness among those who seek a point of connection. A stone bust of Woolf now sits in the garden, and visitors often leave pens, flowers, and handwritten notes at its base, treating the monument as a cenotaph. The strangeness lies in the garden's transformation. After her husband Leonard Woolf passed away, the property eventually became a site managed by the National Trust, turning a private sanctuary into a public landmark. This has created an ongoing conflict between the desire for preservation and the intimacy Woolf craved in her final writings. The official records confirm the site of her final rest, but rumors have long persisted about the specific path she took to the water's edge, and whether any part of her belongings remained hidden in the house for years after the search parties retreated. The lack of a confined burial space means that there is no singular point of closure for those who study her final act, only an open garden that changes with the seasons. The elm trees themselves have weathered the passage of time, with one eventually falling, leaving the landscape altered, and the specific location of the remains subject to the slow, shifting growth of nature. Her husband chose to scatter the remains in a moment of private grief, assuming the act would provide peace. but the public fascination with her final hours ensured that the spot would never truly be silent. The garden remains, and the pens continue to accumulate at the base of the bust, waiting for a story that has already reached its end. While the currents of a Sussex river carried Virginia Woolf away, the frontman of Inks left a resting place that was immediately and physically torn apart. Michael Hutchence was the magnetic, leather-clad voice of Australian rock, projecting an aura of effortless control that abruptly vanished inside a Sydney hotel room in 1997. The official coroner's report ruled his death a suicide, closing the police investigation but igniting a bitter, highly public war over his physical remains. His funeral was a massive spectacle, heavily secured and broadcast to fans around the world, yet the actual disposition of his body became a deeply contested secret. Hutchence was cremated at the Northern Suburbs Memorial Gardens and Crematorium in Sydney, where a simple bronze plaque now bears his name, set quietly among the manicured hedges and stone pathways. Visitors still leave single red roses, worn guitar picks, and handwritten notes at this tranquil memorial, treating the small garden bed as his absolute final home. Cemetery records show the memorial is entirely real, but the ashes tied to it are not whole. In the chaotic aftermath of his passing, his grieving family could not agree on where he belonged, leading to an extraordinary legal and personal battle. Rather than being laid to rest intact, the physical dust of the rock star was ultimately divided into 3 separate portions. 1/3 went to his father, 1/3 to his mother and sister, and the final third to his partner, Paula Yates. Fans who travel thousands of miles to pay their respects are often looking at a shrine that holds only a fraction of the man they idolized, while rumors persist about the exact whereabouts of the other portions. Some accounts claim his mother carried her share in a black velvet bag for years, refusing to let him go, while Yates's portion was reportedly passed down to their young daughter after her own tragic death 3 years later. The official funeral service ended in late November, concluding the public mourning. The private custody battle over his ashes did not. Decades later, the physical location of the complete Michael Hutchence is impossible to map, his remains permanently scattered across continents by the fierce, unyielding grief of those who survived him. The weathered bronze plaque in the Sydney Gardens still offers the public a quiet place to mourn. The man himself remains forever divided. While the tragedy of a sudden end often leaves a public searching for answers in the dirt, the final resting place of Carole Landis remains a quiet, unremarkable corner of Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, that contrasts sharply with the frantic confusion surrounding her passing in 1948. Known to the studio system as the blonde bombshell who boosted wartime morale, her career was defined by her visibility, yet her burial is a study in invisibility. Following the official ruling of suicide by barbiturate overdose in her Brentwood home, the circumstances were immediately clouded by a high-profile doomed romance with a married actor, sparking rumors that the circumstances of her end were more complicated than a simple overdose. The grave itself is marked by a modest, flat bronze plaque set into the manicured lawn of the Great Mausoleum's Sanctuary of Vespers, a place where the sun rarely hits the stone directly, and the air feels perpetually heavy with the scent of lilies left by aging fans. There is no grand monument to her status as a star, only the cold, precise inscription of a name that feels disconnected from the vibrant, breathing woman who once stood before cameras. The official cemetery records confirm her placement, yet for decades, the narrative has been persistently rewritten by those who insist the autopsy reports were influenced by powerful studio executives desperate to protect their investment from scandal. The most persistent object of this lore is a collection of unsent letters reportedly recovered from her vanity, documents that supposedly contain the truth about her final hours but were never made public. While the official account stands firm on the medical evidence, the uncertainty surrounding those missing pages ensures that visitors still stand over the marker, searching for a sign of struggle or resolution that simply isn't there. The grave remains a flat, silent piece of metal in a quiet hall, offering no confirmation to the theories of foul play or the myths of a secret double life. The funeral ended in 1948, but the speculation regarding who actually held the pen to her final chapter has never truly ceased. The grave is still there, tucked away behind sealed glass and stone, while the truth of her last moments remains as inaccessible as the light in the depths of the mausoleum. Leaving the Hollywood glare of Carol Landis behind, we find a grave in the English countryside that draws thousands of pilgrims to a man who died in near-total obscurity. The grave of folk musician Nick Drake sits beneath a massive oak tree in the cemetery of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Tanworth-in-Arden, Warwickshire. He passed away in 1974 at the age of 26. The coroner recorded a definitive ruling of suicide by a fatal overdose of prescribed medication. That official decree is permanently filed in public records, but it is fiercely rejected by those who actually knew him. His family and close friends maintained until their own deaths that he simply made a tragic mistake with his pills while desperate for a single night of sleep. They pointed out that he left no note and had just been actively discussing new recording projects. The medical examiner disagreed, and the official verdict stands. Today, the simple, pale headstone is etched with a brief line from one of his songs, "Now we rise, and we are everywhere." It serves as the physical anchor for a burial site that underwent a strange and massive transformation. For decades, the plot remained utterly quiet, reflecting a musical career that barely made a ripple while he was alive. Then, long after the earth had settled, intense posthumous fame finally found him. What was once a forgotten parish grave is now worn down by a steady stream of global visitors. Fans leave acoustic guitar picks, handwritten letters, and dried flowers pressed against the stone, turning the quiet Warwickshire churchyard into an international shrine. Cemetery logs show a standard village burial, but local legend speaks of a haunting persistence, with devotees occasionally trespassing after dark to play his acoustic records over the soil. The funeral ended in 1974. The story did not. The real tension lies beneath that engraved stone, permanently caught between the coroner's stark ruling of intentional self-destruction and a family's absolute certainty of a careless, heartbreaking accident. The medical files are sealed. The debate over his final state of mind is endlessly rehashed by strangers standing directly over his bones. Visitors keep bringing their small offerings to the shadowed base of the oak tree, hoping to feel close to a ghost. The grave is still there. The answer is not. While Nick Drake rests beneath a peaceful English oak, the final resting place of Gig Young is shadowed by a much darker and far more violent contradiction. On screen, he was the urbane, witty sidekick of classic Hollywood, a man who charmed audiences and eventually won an Academy Award for playing a cynical but charismatic dance marathon promoter. The official ruling on his death in 1978 shattered that polished image completely, concluding that the actor took the life of his new bride before immediately taking his own inside their Manhattan apartment. His remains were shipped back to his childhood hometown and interred at Green Hill Cemetery in Waynesville, North Carolina. The flat granite and bronze marker set flush into the grass bears two identities, listing both his birth name, Byron E. Barr, and the famous stage moniker, Gig Young, alongside a small cross. Visitors occasionally seek out this quiet mountain plot to leave small tributes, a silver coin or a single fading flower. But the site is defined far more by what is missing than what is actually there. The object most deeply entangled with his dark legacy is his Best Supporting Actor Oscar, an item that sparked a bitter and highly publicized post-mortem dispute. According to court records, the actor left the golden statuette to his former agent, but persistent local legends and fan rumors insist that he had secretly wanted the trophy buried alongside him in the Carolina earth. His estranged daughter spent years fighting through the courts to reclaim the award from the agent, a protracted legal battle that kept the horrific details of his final hours circulating in the press long after the funeral concluded. The justice system eventually settled the fate of the statue and returned it to his family, but the grave itself offers no such neat resolution. The quiet cemetery presents the illusion of a peaceful homecoming, masking the brutal reality of a murder-suicide that erased a legacy overnight. It sits undisturbed under the wide North Carolina sky, miles away from the Hollywood machine that built him and the New York apartment where everything ended. The flat bronze plaque catches the afternoon sun, cleanly etched with the names of an acclaimed star, while the earth beneath it silently holds a man who ensured his young wife would never survive her own honeymoon. Breach. We leave these grounds much as we found them, stepping away from the stone rows and the manicured grass as the gates prepare to lock. Looking back down the long dirt paths we just walked, the individual markers begin to blur together, leaving only the strange physical fragments of what happened after the end. A bronze plaque hidden behind a rushing wall of water, a simple stone marker that vanished entirely into the hands of obsessive thieves. A heavy casket moved twice under the cover of darkness, just to find a quiet stretch of undisturbed earth. The official medical rulings on these deaths were written down decades ago, stamped with a coroner's seal, and filed away in municipal archives. The police closed their cases. The biographers eventually published their books, wrapping deeply complicated endings into neat, tragic conclusions. But a grave is a physical thing, and the ground rarely settles as quietly as the paperwork suggests. The tributes still pile up, the crypts still gather fresh scratches, and the dirt continues to shift. The historians eventually turn the page. The cemeteries never close their files.